Excellent question. Basically, who is Hamas? Who is this? What is this beast? Again, I'll try to keep it brief. I shouldn't even bother saying that anymore. So Hamas was born, I think I gave a couple of hints to this already. Hamas was born out of the Muslim Brotherhood, specifically the arm in Egypt. This idea that take one step back, right? The world of Islam has essentially two kind of meta components to it. One is faith and one is politics. When Islam was born in the 7th century, 6th century, those two get combined super fast. Perhaps because it's the third revelation of monotheism, right? Meaning when we look at the history of Judaism, we look at the history of Christianity, we see that it takes a while for that faith identity to become incorporated with some sort of politics or military conquest. But in Islam, it happens very, very fast. Not only does that combination happen fast, but there's also a split in the world of Islam between Sunnah, right? Those who follow the teachings of Muhammad and the authority is granted to those who observe, versus Shia, right? Which is about the sort of the inheritance, the genetic inheritance of leadership through literally the loins of Muhammad. And so as that faith-based concept called Islam spreads throughout the Middle East, it also becomes extremely political with all of its infighting because of that almost immediate split between Sunnah and Shia. And so as that Islamic world develops over centuries, we see Islam as a faith developing in many different ways in many different communities, but also Islam as a political entity developing in many ways in many parts of the Middle East in particular. And so as we move towards the modern age, we essentially see two ways of expressing Islamic identity in the modern world. One is, of course, by establishing Islamic lands that are ruled by an Islamic government, right? We have some that are more nationalistic, some that are a little bit less so, but nonetheless, we have many different Islamic countries, right, in the Middle East, versus the concept of, as Muslims, maybe we're all in this together, right? There needs to be sort of an Islamic empire, like we saw in the early years of Islam, although that also had a number of breakdowns. The point being is that almost every Muslim community, certainly in the Middle East, is constantly sort of jogging between these two identities, political Islam and religious Islam. And so as the Palestinian national identity is born in the late 19th century, right, not coincidentally, the same exact time that Zionism as a form of Jewish national aspiration is born, right? Both of them born under the sort of the auspices of the Ottoman Empire. We have these two different approaches, right? One being a very kind of practical political approach to creating an Islamic country or Islamic nation versus the faith-based approach. And so as we see Palestinian nationalism evolve, literally up until we have the creation of the Palestinian Authority in the 1990s, that has been by and large a political approach, often quite secular, right? Meaning that the terms that many people who identify as Palestinian are using to talk about their aspirations are couched in the politics of the Middle East. The problem is, of course, is that there are many who see Islam as first and foremost a faith. And when you watch a sort of secular nationalistic Palestine being born, obviously it hasn't technically happened yet, but we could certainly argue that it's been in existence for almost 100 years now, right? There are many who came to criticize that as maybe not full enough or maybe even illegitimate, right? As not a true expression of Islamic identity. And so especially when we see the Palestinian Authority in formation as a result of a relationship with Israel, we see the political arm of the militant group known as the Palestine Liberation Organization, right, founded by Yasser Arafat in the early 1950s. So the political arm of that movement called Fatah takes over the control of the Palestinian Authority because Arafat is in fact the negotiator, right, with the Israelis, namely Yitzhak Rabin, if you know the name. that entity that becomes the Palestinian Authority is seen as really corrupt, totally ineffective, and missing that core element of Islamic faith. Right? You cannot be a Palestinian state without some sort of Muslim expression. And so that's where the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoot Hamas comes into play. Hamas stands for the Islamic resistance movement. The Islamic resistance movement. And so it is born, and here's another example of how we need to look before October 7th to truly understand the relationships. It is born in the late 70s, early 80s. It officially comes into being in, I think, 1987 as a separate arm from the Muslim Brotherhood, largely in response to what happened in 1967, right? Which was the Six-Day War, right? When Israel conquers the land that had been controlled by both Jordan, i.e. the West Bank, and by Egypt, i.e. the Gaza Strip. And not only that, but all of a sudden you see the birth of the settler movement, right? Which leads to the occupation. And so the Islamic resistance movement, which is literally what Hamas stands for, is born largely out of confrontation with the Palestinian political leadership that it sees as illegitimate, but also in resistance to the Israeli settler movement and the occupation of the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And so since 1987, Hamas has tried to be sort of a counter element in the Palestinian national identity to Fatah, the PLO, the Palestinian Authority. I just wanted to tack on a couple extra sentences just to explain that while Hamas presented itself, or really was born out of an opposition both to the Israeli occupation, but also to the sort of the ineffectiveness of the Palestinian political leadership, it has only seen more or less a surge in support and approval, right? Despite the fact that obviously not all Palestinians believe in violence. Many of them don't necessarily even know that the Hamas charter calls for the complete and utter destruction of the state of Israel and violence against Jews. But in fact, they are seen as the only other potential in terms of leadership for the Palestinian people, who have largely given up on Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas, its current president. If you pay attention to Palestinian politics, you might know that despite the fact that the Palestinian Authority was born as a democratic institution, they have not had elections since 2005. Why? Because Fatah, as the leading party within the Palestinian Authority, knows full well that any election will lead to its loss. And who wants to go to elections when you already know you're going to lose? Right? So instead, they simply just find many reasons not to have elections, and that is why Mahmoud Abbas has been officially in power for way too long, despite the fact that he has no public support. And so just to understand that while yes, Hamas may be just an abhorrent organization, right, with awful principles, they are seen as potentially the only alternative. And so as we move forward beyond this round of violence and conflict, one of the things that I would like to see happen, and I would like to work on this, of course, with my Palestinian colleagues, because who the hell am I as a Jewish Israeli to tell Palestinians what to do? I would like to try to build the foundations for another alternative, because I think that many Palestinians, given an option, are not necessarily going to agree with Hamas's principles. But they need to find for themselves that third way. And that, I think, is part of that critical element of education, right? Of nuance, and it's not just black and white all the time. Question, if possible? Basically, what's up with all the trauma? Right? Specifically voiced in sort of the name of the Jewish people, right? Stemming from the Holocaust, but not only the Holocaust, right? If you know the joke about Jewish history summed up into one sentence, they tried to annihilate us, we somehow survived, let's eat. Right? That is Jewish identity right there in a nutshell. And so, yes, the Jews are constantly being informed by historical trauma, but important to note that the Palestinians are also constantly informed by trauma, right? For the Palestinians, usually their Holocaust is the Nakba, right? What happened in 1948, 1949 as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel, while certainly many, I would like to think most of the Israelis present, right, at that time were not trying to annihilate or eliminate the Palestinian people. There were a lot of dead Palestinians at the end of that war. And again, we can point fingers who started it, who ended it. And not only that, but there were also many Palestinians who were displaced and still are today from their homes. And so for many Palestinians, they live a life of trauma, constant fear, given that while the Jews who experienced the Holocaust are now in a position of power and dominance, the Palestinians are not. So they could certainly argue that they're still in the trauma of Nakba, as opposed to the Jews who maybe some of us would argue we've kind of come out on top, right? We got a state, we got independence, we have a military, we can defend ourselves. So that's one issue. And we often like to joke, certainly me and my Palestinian colleagues, that we're all playing the trauma Olympics, right? Who's going to get the better trauma and be able to play that card on the table to get something in return? We do it too often. When it comes to modern day trauma, meaning anything that may have happened sort of from the Holocaust forward, the good news is that there are a number of organizations that are trying to sort of, this is going to sound weird, but take advantage of the fact that we are all traumatized. And there's one organization I'm thinking of in particular that I've had some involvement with, but not a lot, because I am very lucky to not have lost a family member yet in the current conflict. Current meaning my 30 years in Israel. But it's called the Bereaved Parents Forum, or sometimes known as the Family Circle. And it is a group of Palestinians and Israelis who have all lost loved ones in one form or another, due to specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they meet on a regular basis, they sponsor events, they have national days of mourning, but they only do it together, so that they can see each other's pain, they can share each other's pain, and they can realize that if we're both being traumatized through this pain, that we don't really have a leg up on each other, right? But that the only way out is for us to take that shared trauma and build from it something better. So there is, I think, a beautiful representation of the most current form of trauma in Israel-Palestine by people hearing each other's trauma and sharing in it. It is by far one of the most moving organizations that I'm aware of. And one of their most important events is that every year when the State of Israel celebrates what we call our National Memorial Day, right, which is when, unfortunately, not like in America where you just have sales in the malls, but rather for every Israeli who has lost, and that's almost every Israeli, you go to a cemetery and you spend the whole day there, right, acknowledging all of your dead relatives. So as a counter to that ceremony being very Israeli, very Jewish, very nationalistic, this Bereaved Families Forum offers a shared Memorial Day observance where you have Jews and Muslims and Christians that come together and all just hold each other. And there are thousands of people who come together, and it's now, ever since Corona, it's being Zoomed all over the planet. So it's a really moving moment where we can see trauma become actually a positive tool. I'm going to leave you on sort of a sad and depressing note, and that is that the historic trauma, unfortunately, is not being dealt with and not being resolved and not being recognized. And that goes back to what I said earlier about narrative, right? If I, as a Jew, came out of the Holocaust and then my redemption was to build the Jewish state of Israel, there's no room for Palestinian suffering in that narrative, at least not the way that it is conceptualized and taught today, right? When you go to an Israeli Jewish school, they do not learn about Nakba. They do not learn about Palestinian suffering or displacement. They only learn about the Holocaust, and that's why we need an Israel. If you go to a Palestinian school, you will almost never hear about the Holocaust. It simply didn't happen. We just have thousands of colonialist Jews right? Supported by Great Britain showing up on the shores of Palestine and then taking over, because it fits the narrative. So when it comes to historic trauma, it's much easier for us to just get in our box and say, no, they'll never understand. We're the ones who are suffering. And that's what fuels these constant rounds of conflict, the lack of trust, the lack of partnership. So we have a lot of work to do. My hope is that some of the initiatives that are sort of building on recent trauma will enable us to create those relationships that will help us deal with the more historic trauma. So there's a little bit of good, there's a little bit of work that needs to be done, but I think that trauma is a really important issue and probably not being dealt with as well as it could be, for sure. Great. So in terms of off-ramps, right, what off-ramps exist to sort of create an exit from this current round of conflict, and what off-ramps might exist politically to get some of our leadership, who don't seem to be listening to Jethro very well, get them out of the way and try something new. So first and foremost, when it comes to the conflict, if you've been paying attention to the news, you know that right now the Israeli leadership at least is waiting for a response from Hamas, unless anybody was checking their phones during church. I hope not. So there could be an update that I'm not aware of. But as of this morning at 9 a.m., we are waiting for the official response from Hamas to a proposal that was worked on over the last couple of days in Paris by the leadership of Israel, Palestine, Qatar, I don't remember who else was there, but a bunch of people. And they sort of came up with a proposal that we don't know the details because, of course, they're secret. They haven't been published yet, but would give us either 1 month or 2 month pause in the fighting in order to release hostages and maybe some form of military withdrawal, right? There's a question as to whether or not it will be accepted by Hamas. And then once it gets accepted by Hamas, the Israeli Security Cabinet will have to sort of give it an official stamp as well. So we do have an off-ramp. It's a temporary one, but it's one that hopefully will give us some hope for building something bigger on that. Just as you may remember back in November, we were able to pause the fighting for, about a week? And we were able to release 100 some odd hostages. And so baby steps is basically what's happening. But there definitely is a conversation thanks to the partnership with countries like the United States, right? And its insistence on kind of either maintaining certain guidelines or always kind of building towards something better. I hear the microphone keeps going out. Countries like Qatar, love them or not, they are a very influential factor on Hamas, given that they almost single-handedly financially support Hamas, and are seen, because of their alliance with the United States, as awkward as that is, they are seen as sort of one of the only reliable brokers in the Middle Eastern arena. And so that's really important. And so with those conversations, again, we have opportunities for exit ramps from this conflict. Unfortunately, very little or very few of those exit ramps are going to actually solve anything. They're just going to allow us to stop killing each other. What we need is even bigger and brighter visions for what happens next. And again, if you've been listening to the news, there are now conversations on the table that are being pushed largely by the American-Saudi partnership to sort of reinvest in the potential Saudi-Israeli relationship in return for an end to the war and some sort of path to Palestinian statehood. Obviously, that's been tried before. It has not yet worked, but I don't see any reason why we should stop trying. And so that, meaning the Saudi card is a big one for Israel. Both because of the potential economic benefits to both countries, as well as because they are clearly, right, that cornerstone of turning the Middle East away from Israel hatred, which has largely been a kind of an undercurrent since 1948. Maybe they had good reason for it or not. I'm not judging, I'm just saying that this could perhaps turn. So Israel very much wants that thing to happen, and if the only way to make it happen is to make progress on some sort of Palestinian statehood front, that could be a blessing in disguise as well. So there are a couple of those, I would call them exit ramps.
But they can't happen with Netanyahu and his government.
Right, so that leads us to the second part of your question, which is political leadership. And I would say that it's very important to always mention Netanyahu and Abbas in the same breath, because they are both ineffective. Neither of them have any public support, at least now. Netanyahu, up until recently, about a year ago, had the most support that any Israeli politician has ever had, and he's been in charge for the better part of 16 years now. But as a result of his sort of fall from grace about a year ago, the fact that nobody in the Israeli political arena wanted to sit with him in a government, and so he had no choice but to reach out to the far-right extremes in order to create a governing coalition, and that put him down this sort of spiraling path towards democratic upheaval, right? The famous judicial reforms that were trying to be passed and thankfully never succeeded. And so he has become quite reviled within Israeli society now. He has about 20% support, according to the latest polls. And that's including even within his own party. And so more than likely, he is only in the war at this moment to save his ass. And that's very, very troubling considering the damage that it's doing. To be fair, most Israelis support the war effort because of what happened on October 7th. So as much as they may not like Netanyahu, they don't necessarily want to just say, we'll cut our losses, get out, and Hamas can still exist. That frightens many, many Israelis. But politically speaking, almost everybody wants to get Netanyahu out of there. The question remains is that since Israel has been sort of leaning rightward for many, many, many years now, what kind of political identity would come to replace Netanyahu? More than likely, it's going to be very right of center. So getting rid of Netanyahu could be a victory, but it may not be a long-term one, because we could still end up with an Israeli public expressing themselves in the sort of very conservative, security-oriented manner that we've become accustomed to. So that's a problem. At the same time, as I mentioned, Abbas has no public support. He has not groomed any sort of next generation leadership. Fatah Hassin is almost entirely irrelevant in Palestinian society, especially in the West Bank, where they actually rule, because of course in the Gaza Strip it's mostly Hamas. And so if elections were being held today, more than likely Hamas would clean the slate and take over charge. And then that becomes a question for not only the Palestinians, right? Do they really want to have this leadership that has embraced violence and destruction? But also for Israelis. How do we move forward if Hamas is democratically elected by the Palestinians, right? If we don't sort of find a way to either encourage or just take a step back and allow the Palestinians to create a different option. And so in terms of political leadership, we're just at the bottom of the barrel. It's awful. And I think many Israelis and Palestinians feel it on a day-to-day basis. Hamas has clearly built up its strength through integration with civil infrastructure, right? Using civil infrastructure as either some sort of shield for military infrastructure or simply blending those two together. And therefore, if we move towards some sort of ceasefire, because we don't want to cause so much civil destruction, both infrastructure and obviously human life, are we not therefore handing Hamas some sort of victory by sort of ending the war before Hamas has been, to use your term, Masha, decapitated, right? So this is something that I think many Jewish Israelis struggle with, the idea of a Hamas existing on your border like it did on October 6th, right? That is obviously very, very frightening, having witnessed what we did on October 7th. And so I would say in terms of popular opinion, that's one of the reasons why I mentioned before in response to the earlier question that most Israelis do not necessarily want to see an immediate end to the war. They might be happy with a pause, right? Because it is becoming increasingly clear that the military operation is not saving hostages, right? That has been the government's claim ever since it began the land operation, about a month or a few weeks after the air operation started. But clearly that has not produced any desired results. If anything, it is only producing the opposite results. Some of you may have seen the news piece where there were 3 hostages who were accidentally identified as Hamas, and they were killed by Israeli soldiers. And not only that, but the more time goes on, we are seeing increasing amounts of dead Israeli soldiers, as well as learning about hostages that are killed in the meanwhile perhaps just out of frustration on Hamas's end. And so as more and more Israeli public opinion, right, is starting to question the military operation as it stands, they are struck with the sort of the dilemma, right? We cannot allow Hamas to exist, but we need to find a way to at least take a break, if not end the war. First and foremost, to rescue the hostages, right? Maybe there's an inkling of an awareness of the death toll on the Palestinian side and not wanting to sort of be responsible for that. As I mentioned before, Israeli media is not perhaps as good at showing on our screens what you might be seeing on your screens, and so many Israeli Jews are not as conscious of what the military operation is doing to the Palestinian people. So that's one element of this issue. I think the bigger question is, right, whether or not we have a pause, whatever agreement we might come to with Hamas, from a political standpoint, again, to go back to the earlier question, with leadership that nobody really trusts, we're all very cynical, we're all very, very unhappy, it's hard to believe that they're going to be building something beyond the conflict, right? We know we can get to an end of the conflict with some sort of negotiated ceasefire, but what happens next? There's a very good chance that we're not going to eliminate Hamas, even if we don't have a ceasefire, right? The Israeli military can easily lay waste in Gaza Strip, and yet Hamas will more than likely still exist. Many of their leadership do not live in the Gaza Strip. That's an ideology that extends far beyond the Gaza Strip. As I shared before, it comes out of a much bigger Muslim identity that spans all across the Middle East and across the world. We're not going to defeat Hamas, right? If you decapitate a few of the military heads, there's always somebody else that's going to eventually come along and take their place. So where's the vision then, right? And this is a different form of decapitation. Where's the vision where Palestinians can see some sort of future that is a little bit brighter and a little bit more hopeful for them to turn to Hamas and say, screw you. I don't like what you're doing. I don't believe you're standing for my cause because, Masha, as you said, you have essentially embraced the fact that civilians are the price to be paid for Palestinian sovereignty and independence, right? It is very much built into the Hamas ideology. Some people are okay with that. I would like to think, certainly based on my experience, most Palestinians are not. So how do we create the thinkers, both Palestinian and Israeli, who are going to think bigger about what happens after the ceasefire, so that we decapitate Hamas, not militarily, but by having the Palestinians say, I'm not voting for Hamas, because that's not what I want for my future. But Israel needs to be a part of that as much as the Palestinians, because we're the ones who obviously have all the power, and we're the ones who have sort of made it our stated goal at the moment to militarily eliminate Hamas, which most of our security top echelon has said never going to happen. It's just impossible, right? You all know it in the form of Afghanistan, right? How long were you there? Did it work? I don't think so, right? How much do you want to invest? How many of your own people do you want to lose for a cause that's maybe not attainable? And so again, bigger picture. That's what I'm looking towards. Obviously, nobody's listening to me. So that's how I would like to decapitate Hamas, by allowing the not allowing, who am I to allow? Having the Palestinians the freedom to create a better path for themselves, and I as Israel have no choice but to work with them hand in hand, because we are inseparable. Right? We live on the same land, we share the same resources, we have a joint economy, there's no way of separating us, even if you believe in two states for two peoples. So we have to work together, and that's why I mentioned those organizations, because we need hope. We need people who are setting an example. So what can the United States do? That's the short of it, right? What can the United States do to help out here? As I mentioned, the United States already has a tremendous stake in Israel and in Palestine and in what's going on between the two of them. As the donor of $3.8 billion a year, mostly in military supplies, equipment, and technologies. That has obviously a tremendous effect on the war element of this relationship. So there is a lot that can be done there. First and foremost, although it is not very popular right now in America and never will be popular in Israel, Israel is the only country, if I'm not mistaken, in America's foreign policy that receives substantial support with no asterisks. Right? There are no qualifications whatsoever. It is simply a blank, not a blank check, but like an unqualified check. If it's not already clear, I just want to say this. I'm a deeply devoted Jewish Israeli. I don't want to punish my country. I don't want my country to disappear. But I also don't feel like my country is being entirely responsible, especially when it comes to the US-Israel alliance. So one thing that can happen is that given that Israel simply cannot exist without military superiority in the region, given some of our existential threats, right? Forget about Palestine. What about Iran? Right? They have been declaring that they will eliminate Israel as soon as humanly possible. And for many reasons, including America pulling out of the nuclear treaty that was established a number of years ago, the Irani government is getting very close and maybe even just around the corner from having a nuclear bomb that they can simply launch. We're a small country, we won't last very long. So there are many existential threats that Israel kind of needs to have that edge. But who's to say that we don't need to earn it, right? Why can't we live up to certain American expectations for the way that we use it and how we function as a society? I love that America's got our backs, but there's something to be said for maybe a little bit tougher love. And I say that with pain, because I know that it's not going to be easy for my people to stomach that, because we've been used to getting this sort of unqualified check. So that's definitely something that could happen. And that is, I know, being talked about more and more in in American political circles than has been in the past. I heard that Bernie Sanders sort of brought it up as some sort of official proposal that got turned down. But again, the more people that are talking about it, the more it can happen. The danger, of course, is that obviously within certain sectors of American political life, there is a very vocal, very left-wing, very anti-Israel kind of element to that conversation. And that makes us very nervous, right? That if the support becomes so overqualified that we simply can't live up to it, then does that in and of itself become an existential risk for Israel? And so that leads to sort of your second half of the question, which is about the public way that this can happen. One of the things I'll just mention as an example that I was quite impressed with is that obviously Joe Biden has a very long history with Israel. Whether you agree or not with his domestic policies, his foreign policies, he clearly has Israel in his heart. Now that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? He's clearly having some challenges now, I understand, with the sort of the American Muslim vote, because he is seen to be a little bit too pro-Israel. But to his credit, as an Israeli speaking, not obviously as an active American, I have very much appreciated the way that he began this journey on October 7th by showing a deep understanding of the trauma that Israel faced and what Israel sort of may have needed to do in the moment in terms of a military response, but over time has kind of altered his position a little bit, maybe not enough in the eyes of some Americans, but certainly enough to piss off a certain number of Israelis by saying, wait a second, we need to qualify that support, right? Especially in light of the ICJ ruling, which was obviously not, clear, but nonetheless sort of put enough cards on the table that both Israel and America need to be very careful about how Israel proceeds with its military operation so that we are not held accountable for genocide and so that America isn't held accountable for supporting genocide. Even though I have no doubt in my mind that Israel is not committing genocide, nonetheless, I don't want to piss off the world. And so Biden and the American administration sort of tilting a little bit, right? Blinken and all of the other folks that are coming to the region and making public statements are being very, very clear that it's not a blank check anymore. And so I would like to see a continued trend in that direction. And I realize that it may not be so public in America, but even if it's only happening behind the scenes, I think that's really critical. There's no secret that there's no love lost at the moment between Biden and Netanyahu, and I think for most of America, excluding American Jews, of course, and Netanyahu doesn't have a lot of friends anywhere at the moment. I think that although that's not very politically appropriate, it has become more and more obvious, and I think that's a good thing because it resonates with many Israelis. And it shows that you simply can't be that extreme and still expect to represent American foreign policy interests to the tune of $3.8 billion a year.
And how about facilitating the Saudi-Israeli relationship?
So that is obviously critical because the only reason the Saudis are in the game to begin with is because of the security arrangement with the United States. Right? The Saudis have an existential threat also from Iran, and the only way that they can sort of buffer that threat is by having an American security backing, and the only way they'll get that backing is by negotiating some sort of relationship with Israel. But of course, the Saudi card that they're going to play is path to Palestinian statehood. So it's a very kind of multilateral issue that hopefully will work out for the best for everybody, even though it's clearly complicated and very uncomfortable for people who maybe don't sit well with some of the actions of countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel, for that matter, Qatar, etc. Because you're going to have to like grimace a little bit when we sign on the paper, but hopefully it leads to a better Middle East.
And the other half was, can the U.S. do anything to facilitate the transformation of this Palestinian leadership?
Yes, Israel has a very deep investment in Palestine, not necessarily to the same tune as Israel, but America is one of the big backers of the United Nations agencies that work and support Palestinians. They have been helpful in facilitating financial support from other Middle Eastern countries to the Palestinian Authority so that it doesn't go, bankrupt. As problematic and corrupt as it is. And so I think, once again, if you're going to show your support, if you're going to declare that you want to see Palestinian statehood happen, there needs to be more checks and balances. And I think that America has an easier time providing those checks and balances to the Palestinian leadership because there is less of a vocal threat, shall we say, or a political threat to the American leadership coming from a Palestinian community than from the Jewish community, right? Obviously, Jews in America have a very loud voice. I think we've earned it, but nonetheless, it's much louder than the Palestinians. So both of those need to happen simultaneously, in my opinion, right? By investing in jobs and civic society, right, beyond sort of the political pathways to statehood and independence. I liked the Salman Rushdie quote. Yes, as with most things in the Middle East, it's a penis thing. We shouldn't be ashamed to say it, right? You've read the Bible, right? Okay, we're a very, very patriarchal, very male-dominated, very chauvinistic society. And that goes for Israel and Palestine, and the rest of the Middle East for that matter, right? Meaning many of the cultures within our own societies still have limitations on what women can do. It is often mind-blowing, certainly for someone like me, who at least spent a certain number of formidable years growing up in America, to see that happen. Now, on one hand, you want to respect faith traditions, and our texts are perhaps not as open-minded and liberal as we might want them to be using our modern eyes, but we have to accept that this is a tension within, certainly within the Middle East. And that's one of the reasons why I think that our creative thinking has not been quite as developed as it should be, because we're thinking with our penises. Generally speaking, a lot of what we do in the Middle East is about power and dominance and military. As a matter of fact, one of the issues that I have found tremendously inspiring that has come out of this war is the fact that many of the mothers of the hostages, this is obviously a uniquely Jewish-Israeli experience, but many of the mothers of the hostages are constantly commenting in public about how all the people making decisions about their children in captivity are white men. And we sort of wonder aloud, what would those conversations look like? How might things be a little bit different if one of those mothers was in the room? I happen to be very close friends with a mother whose child is still in captivity. We're not sure if he's alive or not. You may have seen her on the cover of Time magazine, Rachel Poland Goldberg. Anyways, so she has been one of the leading forces, and she is truly an inspiration to me because she is challenging that sort of male-dominated reality. So that's one issue just to keep in the back of your minds whenever you hear or learn about the Middle East, is that we're not operating necessarily on the same plane as America, although I've seen your Congress. It's also very white and male, but that's a different issue. In terms of the economic aspect to peace, so I hope I don't anger you by saying this, but this was essentially, not anymore, but this was essentially Netanyahu's platform for many, many years. And many Israelis got behind it because Netanyahu essentially rose to power through his basically economic, genius. He was well known for inspiring the kind of shift from socialism to capitalism in Israel, which made a lot of people very wealthy. And while we still retain a lot of that sort of socialist founding in terms of the way society is constructed, we have very much become a very successful capitalist country, right? We're one of the wealthiest countries on earth. We are known as Startup Nation. We have the sort of the most successful high-tech industry. And we have often used that as a sort of a pathway to relationship with the Palestinians, mostly because Netanyahu's political policies have often been about investing in Palestinian jobs to a certain extent. Let's be honest, he's not a lover of Palestine, but enough to be able to maintain peace. And that is precisely where the plan falls apart, because generally speaking, economic peace is about maintaining peace. It's not going to get us far enough. And this goes back to, I apologize for repeating myself, but again, you're dealing with an educator and a historian here. So for me, the only way out is a more holistic approach that has to include narratives, identity, faith, geography, natural resources, and not just economics. So in a way, you're right. Giving young men something else to do with their penises other than shoot at people is a very good way of getting us out of this cycle of violence. But it's not enough, because when those men come home after work at the end of the day, you're right, they're going to be very satisfied that they're supporting a family and building a society, but that's not who they are, because they have a narrative. They're about Muhammad, they're about Islam, they're about Palestine, they're about the ancient Holy Land. And we need to address those things. We need to recognize them and talk about them. And that's what we as Israelis and Palestinians are most fearful of doing. Why? Because what you think about Palestine and what I think about Israel, it's the same damn thing. It's the same land, it's the same faith tradition, the same prophets, like we said. And so we're afraid of having those conversations, but those are the conversations that are going to put us over the edge. So the economic part, I think, is critical. We've seen it work. The hint that I gave before about some of these cross-border organizations that are doing very inspiring work beneath the radar screen are very much connected to that form of economic peace. There's some really good stuff that's happening, but it's not enough because it's not the full picture.
I would think of it as a tier.
Right.
Of what
Yeah.
And that may be a better place for us to put a little more money.
Right. One small caveat, and then I'll get to the next hand, and that is that there is one major downside to economic development as a path to peace. And that is that as we're investing in Palestinian economy and providing jobs, and again, things for men to do, what happens on the Israeli side? Because
we have invested so much money into Israeli.
Right, but because Israel is where it is now, we're not developing. We're already there.
Exactly.
We're extremely successful, which means that Israelis, the more we talk about economic development in Palestine, the more Israelis think, oh, thank God, I don't have to worry about that. I'm already done. And so what do? We tune out. We're not thinking of it as a peace process. We're not thinking of it as building relationships because I'm already there. Right? I got a great job, I got a great community, I can do whatever the hell I please because I'm Israel. I don't have to worry about it the way the Palestinians do. So the economic piece might be working, but it only works on one side. What it does is it allows us, the Israeli Jews, to become too comfortable in our position, thinking we don't need to make compromises. We don't even need to think about the process, because we're up here and we're just trying to help the Palestinians get a little bit closer. But that's it. If we want to move forward, we need to think, oh, I'm going to have to take away a little bit of my supremacy in order to give space to this other community to exist. That's the danger of the economics, if it's not being sort of tied together with other elements, is that we get too comfortable knowing that, we've already made it. We're successful. I'll start with Rabin because it's actually quite personal. So my last job in Boston, before I decided I was going to go visit Israel for 30 years, was working with an organization called Combined Jewish Philanthropies, which is located just down the street, which is the umbrella organization of pretty much all of the Jewish community of the greater Boston area. And the reason I was working there is because I came out of a job, I was living in Spain and Mexico, doing international conference management. And CJP had just been given the task, as happens every year in a different city, of hosting the worldwide conference for all of the Jewish federations, right? Meaning they all get together once a year and have a schmooze fest. And so, I don't know why, but they hired me to run the thing because of my conference experience. So they flew me home from Spain. I was based in Boston. And that, as I said, was my entree into the Jewish world, which then eventually brought me to Israel. My keynote speaker for that conference was Yitzhak Rabin. That conference happened at the end of November 1995. So you can do the math. In early November 1995, I remember very, very clearly I was at the laundromat in Brookline, Massachusetts, where I lived, and I got the news that Rabin had been assassinated. Now, as a young Jew and not so informed Jew, right, my first thought was, oh shit, I just lost my keynote speaker. But then very quickly I realized this is a big deal, especially the fact that he was assassinated by a Jew, another Israeli Jew. So I won't go into much more depth than that, but just to say that while clearly this was an absolutely traumatic moment for most Israeli Jews, and I think many Jews around the world, because we weren't even looking at a potential threat from within the Jewish community. And to this day, I think that we have not truly learned our lessons, because if you know anything about the Israeli government, our Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, was arrested for being part of the community that was threatening Rabin with his life, because he and his political religious world, believed that Rabin was a traitor to the Jewish people by being willing to compromise on Israeli sovereignty, Israeli land, the biblical land, whatever it was. And so the fact that that person is now our Minister of National Security says a lot about how perhaps we have not found the proper path of eliminating extremism, especially religious fundamentalism, from the Israeli politic. There is one good thing that came out of it, and then we'll move on to the second question, and that is that it started a conversation that hadn't happened in Israel and is now happening on a regular basis, and that is trying to bridge the divide between religious Jewish Israelis and secular Jewish Israelis. If you know anything about the Zionist movement, it was born largely out of a secular, nationalistic fervor for creating a response to the quote-unquote Jewish problem. And that is that if the rest of the world wants dead Jews, Israel will take them instead. It really had nothing to do with faith. Obviously, there were people of faith incorporated into the movement. There were even religious responses to Zionism, and we have a movement called religious Zionism. But by and large, it was a secular movement. The world of Jewish faith was sort of brought along for the ride, but it never really fully incorporated into kind of the national hierarchy of what Jewish sovereignty looked like. And that created a lot of tension, a lot of mistrust, a lot of division within Israeli society, and some of that led to what happened in early November 1995. And so since then, we have recognized that that is something we must work on, and there are youth movements and schools and all sorts of wonderful things that are now part of day-to-day Israeli life, where religious Jews and non-religious Jews at least are getting to know each other. Maybe we're not bridging all the gaps, but we're getting to know each other. And so that is one bright thing that came out of the Rabin assassination, simply recognizing our own internal flaws and how to get better at that, right? Something that we could hopefully then apply to some of our external challenges, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
About 3 minutes.
3 minutes, go. Hamas is not concerned with Palestinian Christians. Done. No, just kidding. Look, there's a reason why 10% of the Palestinian diaspora is Christian, and that is because less than 1% of Palestinians in Palestine are Christian. There is something very beautiful about Palestinian Christianity. Well, two things maybe. The first thing is that as a Palestinian Christian, you're growing up and living in the land of Jesus. What more could you ask for, right? There's something amazing about that, and I love when I work with, my Palestinian Christian colleagues, and we sort of share that enthusiasm. Obviously, my enthusiasm is not for Jesus per se, but it's a similar story. The point being that unfortunately, that enthusiasm, that pride, is somewhat diminished by the fact that Christianity is a very small minority, both in the Holy Land and in the entirety of the Middle East. And that because all of you good Christians in the world have welcomed endangered and embattled Palestinians of the Holy Land with open arms into the diaspora communities, many of those Palestinians in Palestine said, screw it, I'm out of here, I'm moving to Boston. Or Detroit, to be more specific. Right? And so one of the issues why Palestinian Christianity is very rarely on the radar screen is largely because so much of that Palestinian Christian community has simply got up and left because they have resources like you. It's a beautiful thing, but it has done a tremendous amount of damage to the Palestinian Christian community. Not that I'm holding you responsible. I'm just letting you know. As a Palestinian Muslim, if you want to say, screw it, I'm out of here, I don't like the conflict, where the hell are you going to go in the Western world? Right? How many Western communities do you know that are opening their arms to Palestinian Muslim society? It's just not happening. And so that's an issue. So the Christian issue, sadly, and I say this because I teach, as I mentioned, predominantly in the Christian world, is not enough on the radar screen. It's always there, but very rarely spoken about on the street. And it's definitely not enough a part of the political conversation. So they are focusing predominantly on Palestinian nationalism. Then they're going to focus on Islamic identity. Maybe then they'll recognize that there's a few Christians hanging out. But it's not really part of the story. Not like it should be. And then the last question, really, really quickly, 1 minute, was about social media. Media is obviously dominated by sex and violence, right? That's what sells, that's what the advertisers want to get on the screen for. It's fine, I'm okay with that. Clearly NGOs who are sitting in a room talking about how my water and your water are the same water, that doesn't sell anything. So they do the best they can. But I encourage you to use resources like me and anybody else you might know who actually lives on the ground, who works in the field, because otherwise you might have a hard time finding that social media presence. They're there. That's how we function. Israelis and Palestinians, we don't use phones anymore. We only use WhatsApp, right? It's all about the group. It's all about the community. It's all about getting out there. But it's very limited in its scope. And so I admit we're not doing a great job getting the word out into the world of the work that's being done on the ground that can and should inspire you all to get involved, but it's there, I promise you. So use people like me as a resource and find out, pick a topic that really interests you, find out which organizations are involved, and then we'll find a way for you to get in there. Okay? Again, be my Jethro. Thank you.